We might have a small crowd tonight, huh?
Might be. Hello, hello. Hi, folks.
Hi,
Good to
Sonia.
see you all. Thanks for being here. I imagine like previous weeks, people will trickle in over the next 5-10 minutes, but extra points to you all for being on time and ready to learn. And so this is our third session with Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. Um, and it's been an absolute privilege, Rabbi Chaim, to learn with you the last two Wednesdays, and we move from anti-Semitism in the college campus to Israel and the ideological roots of how to understand our relationship to the land to Jerusalem, and so. This is a really looking forward to this class and turn it over to you to lead our class, lead our
Thank
teaching.
you. Thank you very much. I hope we can get through the material and learn together. The way I had sort of conceived of the classes was that um, last week was Yom HaAtzmaut, right? The Israeli Independence Day. So I thought that it was appropriate to study the nature of the importance of the land. And in 2 weeks is Yom Yerushalayim, um, the Jerusalem Day. So I thought that this would be appropriate. And I just have to say that Yom Yerushalayim has always troubled me. It troubled me from the very beginning, because I remember 1968, which was the first year um, following the what to say the recapture of Jerusalem. And that year I was at yeshiva. I was a senior in yeshiva college, and we had always had an argument. I mean, that's not that I argued this, but because it was, to me, was a settled issue. But at the yeshiva, there was an argument about whether we recite the Hallel prayer on Israeli Independence Day. I mean, it's still to those who are concerned. There's still people who argue about this issue. The idea of innovation, it's sort of foreign in some Orthodox circles, and the idea of innovating the Hallel prayer, which is a statutory prayer with a blessing, seems requires some degree of authority to do so. The chief rabbinate did introduce the prayer. However, in the yeshiva circles, the argument. I mean, I don't know whether you'll understand the nature of this significance, but in the yeshiva circles there was a dispute. Should you say the Hallel prayer, which are, I think, 4 or 5 psalms that constitute the prayer? Do we say them with the blessing or without a blessing? All right, and seems like a rather picayune, you know, question. I mean, maybe there are a few lawyers here who understand the nature of legal intricacies. What struck me, and in a way, it sort of frames our discussion today, was that in 1968, the year after the recapture of Jerusalem, there was no discussion at all. And it was assumed that the Hallel prayer should be recited without any question, and certainly with a blessing. So the question was, why? Israeli Independence Day didn't seem to merit the Hallel with a blessing. But the capture of Jerusalem, wow, that gets Hallel with a blessing. And that really bothered me, because it showed a total lack of understanding, it seems to me, of Jewish history. Clearly, the establishment of the state of Israel, whatever our problem, we're not talking politics today. Well, as if it's possible, but I mean, we're not talking about contemporary politics. But clearly, establishing the state of Israel was a transformative act in the history of the Jews. And it not only transformed, it saved Jewish lives, because no Jews didn't have anywhere to go. Displaced Jews had nowhere to go. Among the Jews who came to resettle Israel, 400,000 survivors came to live in Israel. So, of course, it's deserving of a song of praise. So why was it so simple to grant Jerusalem the significance of the Hallel, whereas it was difficult to do so for Israeli Independence Day? So you can just imagine what people were thinking, that the recapture of Jerusalem was seen as, and the Six-Day War was seen as clear evidence of what someone unmute themselves if you want. I don't, can you do so? It was clear evidence of what? That would merit reciting the Hallel. Of a miracle.
Divine intervention.
Yeah, it's a miracle. So of course we have to bless the miracle. Right? So what people and yet the greater, I mean, this is also, by the way, a failure from a religious perspective to understand the nature of miracle. Because most people think that miracle means the overturning of nature and something supernatural. Miracle is a consciousness about natural events, and how natural events are amazing. I mean, that's really how Heschel understood a miracle. That nature itself is a miracle. The miracle was that thousands of people were able to resettle the land and to establish a state and start their lives all over again. In other words, the political normal process, well, right, the special political process that in which Jews engaged in establishing Israel was itself miraculous, if that's the standard that you have to use. But beyond that was a question that I had, and that bothered me as the years wore on after 1968, that basically we had been seduced by stones and by holy place, and we allowed that to be a dominant idea. And that's why when Jerusalem was recaptured, it was a simple decision to understand that you say the Hallel prayer because it's holy. Whereas the land of Israel was a secular state. And that wasn't going to be blessed, with a full Hallel. But Jerusalem, then you're entering a new domain. You're in God's domain. So once you enter God's domain, you're in trouble. Right? Because who's in control? That's really the question. Because if you can control God's domain, boo, woo, 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 right? So you have enormous power, and that's really part of the discussion about Jerusalem. So it is a fraught question, this idea of the holiness of Jerusalem, and the question is, does religion act as a control over nationalism, or is religion seduced to embrace nationalism and become chauvinist? That's really part of the discussion around Jerusalem. So I want to start by reading to you, sharing with you an email that I received from an old friend, in fact, a colleague with whom I worked for many years. And he writes the following. He lives in Israel. Dear Chaim, shalom ubracha. I wanted to express a deep feeling that I have had for a number of years, which was confirmed again this year. I was in Jerusalem in 1967, and on the Shavuot of that year, I prayed at sunrise at the Kotel, at the wall. It was one of my most important spiritual experiences. I was filled with the potential of the day. Since that day, I have suffered from a decline in the dream. Yom Yerushalayim, the day of celebrating the unification of Jerusalem, has become a Yom Evel, a mourning day. I try to avoid it and avoid saying the Hallel prayer. The so-called dance with the flags through the Arab quarter of the old city reminds me of marches of flags in an era of great pain. The words about Ir Shechubra La Yachtav, Jerusalem as a city that bound us together, are painful because that did not happen. And Yom Yerushalayim, the day of celebrating the unification of Jerusalem, has replaced Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. This, I want to sort of illustrate. I mean, if you can see this, I kept this. So this was an ad from the Jerusalem Post, I think, when I was in Israel a couple of years ago. How many years ago? It must be many years ago. 2021, so not that many. The 27th annual Tisha B'Av Eve walk around the walls. So on Jerusalem Day, there's a march of flags through the Muslim quarter towards the Kotel, and on Tisha B'Av, there is the march of circling the city on the city walls. Now, the truth is that the idea of circling the city walls on Tisha B'Av sounds like a good idea. Tisha B'Av, after all, is the day of mourning for the destruction. And by circling the city, we're sort of affirming that the city has been reborn, right? There's something actually quite inspiring about it. But there's another factor here, and that's the politicization of the spirit and what's happening. So that's what I want to unfold as we discuss, as we learn tonight. I mean, in other words, I want you to think about the following, and you'll hear it explicitly, that when people march around the city, whether it's the March of the Flags on Jerusalem Day through the Arab quarter, or whether they march around the walls on the 9th of Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the temple, what they're doing is they're asserting Jewish sovereignty over the city. And they're transforming the holy city into a political haven in a way, and exploiting the holiness of Jerusalem to assert control. I mean, and that's really the bottom line. And that's what we're dealing with. So let's go back to our sources and see how this unfolds. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you find the sources. No, it's not here. No, why is it not here? 1 second. I know. No. Can you see this? Can you see the sources?
No.
No.
If helpful, Chaim, I put the link into the chat from what you
All right,
sent.
but all right, I just said I need to be able to, let's see. Now you can't see that, huh? I don't know why I have share screen. Here it is. Okay, here we are. Everybody can see this? Yeah, okay. All right, so let's get a little background and let's dive into this. All right. Now, one of the central issues about Jerusalem is the convergence of holiness, of the holiness of Jerusalem, the convergence of three religions around the city of Jerusalem, and the fact that Christians, Muslims, and Jews all consider it to be a sacred place. And specifically, I want to deal with the Muslim claim, only because of the following: that in general, in a Jewish discussion of the Muslim claim, we have been very dismissive. After all, I don't know how many of you how many of you haven't heard the lecture that says that that Jerusalem is mentioned 600 and some odd times in the Bible, but it's not mentioned at all in the Quran, right? You've all heard that. So that's the proof that it can't be a holy city for Muslims. But it clearly doesn't tell the whole story. So first of all, this section from the Quran is fascinating, where Muhammad is giving instruction to the people about prayer to his followers. And he says, "The ignorant among the people will say, what has turned them away from the direction of prayer they once followed? Say, to God belong the east and the west. God guides whom God wills to a straight path." Now, the problem with the Quran is that oftentimes the language is elusive. It doesn't seem to be, specific and grounded. So you really need a commentary. I want to recommend to you, really, this is an outstanding commentary, the Study Quran. It was edited by Sayyid Hossein Nasser, who was a professor at George Washington University. I heard him lecture a number of times. He's a Sufi, a scholar, and a religious personality. And the commentary, just so you take a look, it's pretty extensive. I always, the first Quran that I bought, I went, you remember Borders? I went into Borders, and I asked for a Quran, and what I looked for was the thickest one, because I wanted a Quran with Rashi. I mean, right? I mean, I wanted a commentary. How can you read a text without commentary? So it turns out that I bought a Quran that was actually, I am forgetting his Islamic name, but the author of this Quran commentary, which was excellent, Muhammad Assad. Muhammad Assad. Anyone know who Muhammad Assad is or was? Muhammad Assad was the Pakistani representative to the United Nations. He wrote the charter, the national charter of Pakistan, which was supposed to be the ideal Muslim nation. But his born name, Muhammad Assad, was Leopold Weiss. He was a converted Jew. It's an unbelievable story. And he wrote a book, he wrote an autobiography called The Road to Mecca. He was taken by the simplicity of the desert Muslims with whom he lived in Arabia, and he rejected the arrogance of the Jews. I mean, he was very sensitive, very, very interesting. He met Chaim Weizmann, he was a journalist. His family was a very sort of well-placed European family. So, and by the way, his commentary is outstanding. Muhammad Assad's on the Quran. It's a real, you can tell the difference in quality between his commentary and others. But this, I would recommend this this is a new, really excellent commentary. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a formative episode, a foundational episode in Islam. To what direction do you pray as a Muslim? If I asked you, you'd say, oh, of course, Muslims pray to Mecca. But do we know that in his original plan, and we're not sure of all the years, I mean, we don't have all the evidence, but for sure, for a period of time at least, when Muhammad came to Medina, in other words, he left Mecca, right? His hagirah, his emigration from Mecca to Medina, right? When he came to Medina, where there were 3 Jewish tribes, he prayed facing Jerusalem. And one of the explanations for why he prayed facing Jerusalem was he wanted to attract the Jews to follow him. So he tried to accommodate Jewish inclinations, here literally a physical inclination, and when the Jews turned their backs on Muhammad, so Muhammad turned his back on Jerusalem and faced in the other direction towards Mecca. I have to say, but in all truth, he never really turned his back on Jerusalem. I mean, he did in the direction of prayer, but Jerusalem always was important to him. And I would go so far as to say that Muhammad, I agree with those who hold that even when he was in Mecca, before he traveled and ran from Mecca, he was forced to leave Mecca because the merchants in Mecca oppressed him because he was diminishing their central locus of prayer and their central holy place, which was the Kaaba, which at that time housed their idols, their religious symbols, which Muhammad had rejected as he was developing in favor of monotheism. So Muhammad, in his original form of prayer, faced towards Jerusalem, is my sense. Then he came to Medina, where he continued to face towards Jerusalem. And when the Jews rejected him, he turned around and he faced towards the Kaaba. In the Quran, by the way, I don't know whether you know this, that the Kaaba, which is at the center of Muslim prayer, was claimed to have been established by none other than Father Abraham and Father Abraham's favorite son, Ishmael. Right? So we have parallel tradition, right? What did Father Abraham do for us? Well, he almost killed his son, but where did he do that? He did that on Mount Moriah. What is Mount Moriah? Mount Moriah is the location of the temple. So here you have in both, it's fascinating. The Muslims claim that Abraham established their temple, the Kaaba. And the Jews claim that Abraham established our temple at Mount Moriah, in a way, the foundational moment. So you understand that we have parallel stories that each if we at least paid attention, we would say, you know what? We each draw strength from one another. There's a common bond here. What are we fighting about? You know, mine is greater, my holiness is greater than, I mean, all of this stuff. If we realize that it all comes from the same source, and and we shouldn't be so, controlling, imperial, controlling, and say, oh, they got it from us. Well, because every idea derives from somewhere else. We just have to be respectful about sharing notions, sharing ideas, and even sharing places. That's where I want to go. So here Muhammad is telling his followers, it's only the ignorant who get all upset about turning away from, because what it seems to be a reference to is that Muhammad has given instructions to turn away from Jerusalem and face in the direction of Mecca to another Qibla. The Qibla is a direction. In fact, in Medina, and I've never been there, so I don't know, but they say to this very day, there is a mosque with two Qiblas. It has the plural, Qiblatin. Like Qibla is a direction. Why two Qiblas? Because it has the original direction of Jerusalem, and then it has the other direction on the other side of the mosque to Mecca. And the Qibla is designated by, if you walked into a mosque, you'd understand, you'd know immediately where the directional place is. It's like where the Aron Kodesh would be in a synagogue. So Muhammad says, to God belongs the east and the west. What are you all arguing about? Which way? God is everywhere. And the only reason you face one way or another is because God told us to face that way. It's not that the way itself is the essential holiness. It's God's word has directed you there. Skip the next paragraph and you'll see it clearly. We have seen your face turn towards the heaven, right? You were seeking God. So we will turn, we is always God. This is God speaking. So we will turn you towards a direction that will satisfy you. So turn your face towards a sacred mosque. And wherever you may be, turn your faces towards it. Those who were given the book, well, okay. So turn your face towards a direction that will satisfy you. There seems to be, perhaps introduced here, a bit of a national element. So Muhammad was basically saying to his followers, you know what? We need to distinguish ourselves from Judaism. As much as I respect Jerusalem, it's important that we have our own direction and that we not be confused and not be confusing. And so this is part of the process in which religions separate themselves one from another. We have a similar story with Sabbath and Sunday in Christianity. Until the 4th century, there's no evidence, as far as I know, of Christians celebrating the Sabbath on Sunday. It's only in the 4th century that the Christian Sabbath became Sunday. Why? To distinguish themselves from the Jewish Sabbath, which was on Saturday, which was on Shabbat. Okay, so Muhammad is creating a distinguishing quality in Islam. So they're facing towards Mecca. Okay, now here we have a source from about the 9th century, 8th or 9th century. It's called The Secrets of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's a very late midrash, or let's call it a medieval midrash, and of course Shimon Bar Yochai is associated with it because he was already considered to be the author of a mystical treatise. He himself had hidden in a cave. How many years was he in the cave? Was it 12 years in the cave? And so he would have access to those mysteries. So the text says as follows: the second king who will arise from Ishmael will be a friend of Israel. This is fascinating because this is a document or a text that's contemporaneous with the rise of Islam. Rather than see it as sort of a prophetic text, it's actually written in that period, and it's reflecting on the history of that period. But it does so in a prophetic way. So it says, who will arise? But actually, the person who wrote this knew what was happening. And he knew that Omar, who had come to Jerusalem, the Caliph Omar, and who had captured Jerusalem, and who came who was invited, I'm sorry, the Christian rulers of Jerusalem were not willing to surrender until Omar came personally. Omar made a personal visit, went to the Church of the Holy, was welcomed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was invited in by the bishop to pray in the church, yet chose to pray on the stairs adjacent to the church. And it's in the location of those stairs removed from the church, which was moved later on as well, that the Mosque of Omar, or the Shrine of Omar, was built as a commemoration. Why did he not pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? This is an interesting story about the generous side of Islam. He understood that if he prayed in the church, that would designate the church as a Muslim holy site. And he did not have any desire to eradicate Christianity. It wasn't his dream to do so. The Jews welcomed the Muslims as conquerors of Jerusalem because they were persecuted by the Christians. And they saw the Muslims as their liberators. In fact, the king, Omar, who conquered Jerusalem, is called in some of the sources and referred to as Al-Farak, F-A-R-A-K, and Farak is related to the Aramaic Hebrew Yukum Purkon. Maze Purkon? Purkon is salvation. It's part of the Shabbos prayer. Yukum Purkon min Shemaya. Right? May salvation come from heaven. So Al-Farak was the savior. Who was the savior? Omar. So here is a source that says that the Muslim who conquered Jerusalem was a savior of the Jews. So ask yourself, where does all the hostility come from? This is the reflection of someone contemporary with the rise of Islam. So the text continues. The second king who will arise from Ishmael will be a friend of Israel. He will repair the breaches and fix the breaches of the temple and shape Mount Moriah and make the whole of it a level plain. The mistake here, he will build for himself there a palace for prayer upon the site upon the site of the foundation stone, as scripture said, and set your nest on the rock, right? Sim basela hinecha. So the nest, the temple, is placed on the rock, the even shtia, the foundation stone, which is actually supposedly at the center of the Mosque of Omar, or the Shrine of Omar. It's not technically a mosque because it's not technically a prayer place. The Al-Aqsa is the prayer place. He will wage war with the children of Esau and slaughter their troops. So this is part of this prediction. My fellow Jews, don't worry, the Savior is here. He's going to get the Christians. He will wage war with the children of Esau and slaughter their troops and capture a large number of them. And eventually he will die in peace and with great honor. All right. Not all of this happened in this fashion, but this was assumed to be what will be the fate. What did happen was, indeed, Omar came and basically liberated the Jews of Jerusalem and rededicated the temple site. I mean, in a sense that it became, he prepared it for its use because it was recognized as a sacred place. In commemoration of Omar's prayer in Jerusalem, the shrine of Omar was constructed on its site. Right? Now, the temple was never rebuilt. Now, why was the shrine of Omar built on the site? Why? It could only be for one reason. Because the Muslims recognized the temple site as a holy place. And like all conquering armies, you build your holy place on the site of the former holy place to draw the holy energy that inheres in that place. So there's a recognition, actually, of the holiness of Solomon's temple in the building of the shrine on the Temple Mount in that fashion. Okay, so, but what if you walked into the shrine of the rock and you looked at the inscriptions on the walls of the shrine, you will note that there are curses that are critical of Christian doctrine of the Son of God, because the idea of the Son of God is anathema to Islam. It violates the central principles of monotheism. And so that's totally unacceptable. So to a certain extent, the building of, it's interesting, the building of the Shrine of Omar was not a sort of supersessionist move against Judaism. On the contrary, it was a supersessionist move against Christianity, right? It was a way of sort of denouncing, we have arrived and we are somehow, above, have transcended Christianity.
Chaim, can I ask you something?
Yes.
So I'm trying to connect what you just said about a supersessionist move with Christianity with what you said before about the decision not to.
Yes. So but that was Omar.
Okay.
This happened. The shrine was built by Saladin, Saladin, and that came after the Crusaders had come. The Crusaders interrupted things for a few years, and they were seen as evil, and so that's when Christianity had to be decimated.
Okay,
and that's maybe the prediction that's given. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's the prophet. No, this was written too early for that, but that's really where it comes from. So the fact that the dome of the rock was built over the foundation stone is a giveaway. Tells you that the dome is drawing its holiness from the foundation stone in the same way that the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was built on this site. Now it's also the rock is assumed to have been, or is suggested to have been, the place from which Muhammad alighted on his night journey. If you're not familiar, chapter 17, I think, of the Quran, Muhammad goes to Jerusalem one night. If you ask Mrs. Muhammad, she would say he was in bed all night long. He had a dream, and he had an amazing dream, because when he went to Jerusalem, he parked his horse at the Kotel. I think the horse is called Barak or something like that, right? And then he sort of rose to heaven. And who did he meet in heaven? Moses, Jesus, all the prophets, and they prayed together. It was sort of a universal moment of universal prayer. All of this stemming from his association with Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is a city of unification. That's where religions come together. I mean, it's kind of striking. If you see Muhammad's dream prayer in this light, what the Quran says is that he went to the furthest mosque. What's the Arabic for the furthest mosque? Al-Aqsa. Anyone know the Hebrew root, the cognate? What do you hear? Katzeh. Katzeh. Katzeh is the edge, right? The furthest. So Al-Aqsa is the furthest mosque. So that's where the shrine is on one place in the Temple Mount, and Al-Aqsa is over to the side, which is the central prayer place on the Temple Mount. Now, if you actually look at the architecture of the dome and sort of its spatial connections, you could argue that the dome and Jerusalem are placed in line with Mecca, and that actually what the Muslims were trying to achieve in constructing the dome was to link Jerusalem with Mecca. And throughout their history, they attributed holiness, importance, and significance to Jerusalem. It's not true that Jerusalem doesn't figure in the history of Islam. What is true is the following: that all throughout the centuries, when Muslims controlled Jerusalem, Jews were not interested in this whole question of the holiness of Jerusalem. Meaning, it was not a political question for Jews. Only when, right, Jews retook Jerusalem did there begin to be this competition and this idea of whose holy city is it? Is it our holy city? Is it our holy place, or is it your holy place? And this conflict over the Temple Mount, which has caused the death of many, spilling of blood over the years. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact that the 1929 Hebron massacre, it wasn't just in Hebron, but the massacres in Israel or in Palestine in 1929 were occasioned by the fact that the Mufti announced that the Jews were about to take over the Temple Mount. It was around Tisha B'Av, and there was some movement of benches. I mean, there were all sorts of rules. If you look at all the photos of the wall, right, then it's a very narrow place. It's in many ways a place that was had been in some ways disregarded, right? There is I think a stone resting place where some people can be seen seated, but there are no permanent seats at the wall, of which there are none today either. But what excited the Muslim crowds were the fact that someone had been seen moving a bench, and the rumor spread that the Jews are coming to take over the Temple Mount, and that of course that yielded a sort of a wild a massacring crowd. Now, I just want to show you one more thing having to do with the sanctity of Jerusalem and this whole argument about recognition, because Jewish association with the Temple Mount and this debate between Muslims and Jews took a new turn in the recent period, because some of you may know that Yasser Arafat, in negotiations with Camp David, denied that the Temple Mount was the site of the Jewish temple, of Solomon's temple, and that Solomon's temple was actually built elsewhere. And there are, by the way, some Bible scholars who side with this Muslim assertion. But all of this is, which one of us controls the holy? Who is in charge? To whom has God given, God's right, right? So and we play right into this debate along with the Muslims. But I want you to see that in my collection of memorabilia and posters and brochures, I have this guidebook to the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, printed in this one. This one is 1925. Actually, it's not the one in my collection. Mine is from 1924. But all right, but it's okay. It's the same guidebook. And here on this page, if you can read with me, if I put on my glasses, it says, it's actually hard to read. Here it is. The two principal edifices are the Dome of the Rock on a raised platform in the middle and the Mosque of Al-Aqsa against the south wall. Other buildings, which we shall consider later, lie dotted above here and there. On the left, along the east wall, the double portals, etc., etc. On every side, trees brace the prospect, which lend a peculiar charm to the scene. The site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest, perhaps from prehistoric times. Adam, right? Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This too is the spot, according to the universal belief, in which David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Okay, so there's a recognition of the fact that there's Jewish history or Israelite history that predates the building of the construction of the mosque and the sanctification of Jerusalem as a Muslim holy site. I mean, it's very important that there is this recognition. In fact, a couple of years ago, I had my annual cup of coffee with Sari Nusseibeh, who was at that time the president of Al-Quds University, and he was a friend of mine, or is a friend of mine, that I know for years. And I mentioned this brochure to him, and he said to me, "Send me a copy." Not because he didn't know this, he knew this, but he knew that most of the students at his university don't know this and don't believe this. And he wants to have a copy to show people the evidence that Islam recognizes that the Temple Mount is the Jewish Temple Mount, and stop the monkey business about claiming that we have no connection to Jerusalem historically. That's not the point. The question is, can we share Jerusalem, not who owns Jerusalem? Because the real question is, who can own holiness? Only God. The attempt to politicize holiness is actually a heretical act to suggest that humans dominate God, and that and I think that has to be the reference point, and that also allows us an insight into what's actually going on with politically. Take a look at the next group of sources. Okay. Well, first, before we see the next group of sources, no, what happened? We're missing a page. 1 second, I'm missing a page here. Excuse me. Yeah, 3. Okay. Well, no, huh? Well, it's different from my text. All right. What can I tell you? All right, we'll get to those sources later. All right, to the politics. All right, so let's start learning. Let me move. Okay. So this is another poster in my collection, and as you see, Azhara Rabim, it's a warning, a public warning. You could read the English translation. Our dear brethren who come from far and near to visit the holy city of Jerusalem, be warned and remember that it is strictly forbidden by Jewish law and religion to enter the temple area or to ascend the Har HaBayit. Okay, so this was issued by Rabbi Cook. Who is Rabbi Cook? Rabbi Cook was the chief rabbi of Palestine, appointed by the British in 1920. And in the minds of most religious authorities, this is actually still in force, this prohibition. Yet, at the same time that everybody is aware of the prohibition, a group of rabbis, mostly from the settler community, have issued a call, a decree, Nichtav Chizuk, a letter of strengthening that is focused on the Temple Mount. I'm sorry, I don't have an English translation. L'shichno tidrishu uvata shama. To his place of presence you shall seek his place of presence, and you shall come there. They take this to mean that there is an authoritative imperative to seek God's presence on the Temple Mount, and therefore to ascend the Temple Mount. Now, I want to point out that in Rabbi Cook's prohibition, it's interesting that although he does use the word here, ascend the Har HaBayit, right? In the Hebrew, that doesn't appear. The Hebrew uses a different verb, the first verb here, enter. The Hebrew says the prohibition is, I'm sorry for the dizziness, shel haknisa l'makom hamikdash b'Har HaBayit. The entering of the place of the temple and the Temple Mount. Entering. The Talmudic language is entering. Aliyah lahar habayit. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? That's a political interpolation. No, the Aliyah is a political act. It's emigration, right? That's how it's used. Aliyah le'eretz Yisrael. Here, if you look at the declaration of the rabbis here are talking about aliyah here, lechizuk ha'aliyah lahar hakodesh, the ascending to the holy mountain. And here you have a list of all I think, a sterling crew of rabbis, including some that are known to you, Harav Shlomo Riskin, who signed this, familiar to many Americans. Rabbi Druckman, all the leaders of the settler movement signed this declaration, and now for years, there's been this tension around people ascending the Temple Mount. And what happens when they ascend the Temple Mount? There's this challenge because the arrangement was that Jews will not pray on the Temple Mount. How could that be? It's an embarrassment. It's shameful. It's our Temple Mount. We conquered the territory. What happened? You know what happened. 1967, Moshe Dayan came to Jerusalem and he saw the Israeli flag flying over the Dome of the Rock. He ordered the soldiers to remove the flag and he said, "We will not have a Vatican." Moshe Dayan understood something intuitively. He didn't have a Talmudic understanding, but he understood the temple is a dangerous place. Holiness is dangerous. We want to have a country. we don't want to have holiness, because holiness is going to explode in our faces. And so let the Muslims continue with that's their place of worship. Let it be their place of worship. We do not have to have a war over a holy place. Yes, Morris, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering, if the prohibition from Rav Kook and the permission from all of these settlement rabbis actually come from the same ideological place, which is an assertion that the Temple Mount actually is this exclusively holy Jewish site, but they just have different interpretations on whether a contemporary Jew can visit that site
Yes, well,
in this day and
that's
age.
what we're going to get to.
Okay,
That's what we're going to get to.
okay.
Okay. All right. But again, to use contemporary language, the argument is about weaponizing holiness, right? That's how we would talk about it, and there's something about Rabbi Kook's prohibition that I feel sort of intuitively, which is Rav Kook was a Kohen. There was nothing more that he would have loved, it seems to me from a religious perspective, than to be part of the movement that would, rebuild the sanctuary, the locus of holiness for the priests to approach God. In fact, all his life, he studied the tractates in the Talmud that had to do with kochim, with sacrifices. He wrote a commentary on kochim himself. He was very invested in it. But you know what? There was a certain wisdom in the Jewish tradition to stay away from rebuilding the temple. And to create for us a really magnificent tradition, if you think about it. We pray every day, if you daven 3 times a day, to rebuild the temple, and you don't do it. It's a way of maintaining a tension between anticipation and fulfillment, and understanding that maybe it's okay it's not just maybe it's okay, that the strength of an idea is in the anticipation of the idea, not always in the fulfillment of it, because it keeps us focused and it allows us to understand something beyond the material achievement. So what's going to happen after you build the temple? It's done. Then you're going to have a building committee, and who's going to contribute? Whose name will be on the plaque? I mean, what is it going to be? The holiness is something to pursue, not something to build. I think that's sort of a magic of Judaism, that we were not, at least the normative tradition, right? Not these deviant politicians, right? And these rabbis who are rushing up to the Temple Mount, who want to build a temple. The normative tradition understood the value of patience and understood the value of yearning and of not getting there, right? Right. That's what the messianic move is really all about. It's not about the Messiah coming. It's about waiting, but it's about waiting creatively and active waiting in a way that you're always aspiring. You're aspiring to holiness, because holiness is something elusive, and that's something you have to build towards. All right. Now, the architect of Rabbi Kook's position is Maimonides. And Maimonides writes as follows in the laws of the temple, right? He writes, he writes as follows. And I'm going to start with the second clause. I'm sorry, it begins, if so, how was the second temple consecrated? With the first consecration performed by Solomon. For Solomon consecrated the temple courtyard and Jerusalem for that time and for eternity. So there's an argument in the Talmud about, and we studied last week, actually we touched upon this, about how holiness came to the land. So the initial position was that Joshua, when he conquered the land became holy. So the Maimonides says as follows. How was this? Because the holiness of Joshua's conquest did not last. Why didn't it last? Because holiness that's derivative of conquest is ephemeral, it's passing, because it only lasts as long as you have power. Once you become the prior power and someone else conquers the territory, the holiness is then canceled. So Joshua's holiness was canceled. If so, how was the second temple consecrated, right? By what virtue when the second temple was built? Because the site was no longer holy. With the first consecration performed by Solomon. In other words, what Maimonides is claiming is that when the temple was built in Solomon's time, that holiness that descended upon the temple remains forever. Therefore, because the site is holy, Jews who are not prepared, because there is no red heifer, there's no purification rite, are prohibited from entering the Temple Mount. I read this to mean that we are prohibited from establishing political control over the Temple Mount. That's really what the rabbis wanted to achieve, to distance us from sort of this manipulation, the attempt to manipulate holiness, which all peoples want to do, because that's how they dominate others. Therefore, says Maimonides, we may offer. Listen to what he says. I mean, we don't follow his ruling on this. Therefore, we may offer all the sacrifices on the temple site, even though the temple itself is not built. I'm saying we don't follow it, meaning that most people aren't offering sacrifices on the Temple Mount these days. Similarly, sacrifices of the most holy order can be eaten in the entire area of the courtyard, even though it is in ruin and not surrounded by a divider. And this also pertains to the sanctity of Jerusalem. So the holiness of Jerusalem is something that somehow lasts forever. Maimonides continues by saying as follows: why do I say that the original consecration sanctified the temple in Jerusalem for eternity, right? While in regard to the consecration of the remainder of the land of Israel, in the context of the sabbatical year, tithes, and other similar agricultural laws, did not sanctify it for eternity, meaning the sanctity of the land, Maimonides is emphasizing, results not in, like the earth is holy, and therefore you can't touch the earth. The sanctity of the land means that you have obligations. What are the obligations? Sabbatical obligations, tithes of the poor. I mean, there's a whole list. I don't want to get into it, but it's the mitzvot that you're engaged with in the land that reflect this idea of holiness. The land itself is not the source of the holiness. It's the doing of the mitzvot on the land that actually invest or bring about a sensibility of holiness. However, the sanctity of Jerusalem remained forever. It was not something that was dependent upon another consecration. Why? Why did Solomon's consecration of the temple last forever? Because the sanctity of the temple and Jerusalem stems from the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah can never be nullified. Therefore, Leviticus states, I will lay waste to your sanctuaries, the sages declared, even though they have been devastated, the sanctity remains. Listen to the verse, I will lay waste to your sanctuaries. So it remains a sanctuary, meaning a holy place, even though I have laid waste to it. It's called a sanctuary. Now, what does Maimonides mean when he says that the Shekhinah, the sanctification of the Shekhinah, pertains to the Temple Mount and to Jerusalem? So I want to read to you the verse from Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 7:1. I know we're all familiar with Chronicles. So Chronicles is actually rehearsing the dedication of Solomon's temple, which was built, in the book of Kings. We read about the temple, and in Chronicles it reads as follows: when Solomon concluded his prayer, v'ha'esh yarda mehashamayim, and the fire descended from heaven, v'tochal ha'olah v'hazvafim, and it consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. Uchvod Hashem alei habayit, and the glory of God filled the house. So how did the Shekhinah descend on the Temple Mount? Through the fire that descended from heaven during the time of Solomon. So Maimonides, in a very atypical move, is actually, how should I say, he is attributing significance to a rather mystical experience but he's doing it for a cause. He wants to remove the sanctity of Jerusalem completely from the human domain. He doesn't want it to operate as a question of whether we control it or don't control it. Does that make it holy or not make it holy? God made it holy. And therefore, what he's saying is, stay away. Stay away. It's dangerous. God made it holy. The holiness came about because of the fire descended. By the way, we have a similar story in the book of Maccabees at the rededication of the temple about locating the fire that Jeremiah had hidden, the fire of the altar. So there's something about the sanctity that's linked to this holy fire. So Maimonides continues, therefore, when the land was taken from their hands by the Babylonians, their original conquest was nullified, and that's why the land lost its holiness. Thus, according to Torah law, the land was freed from the obligations of the sabbatical year and of tithes because it was no longer the holy Eretz Yisrael. When Ezra returned to Eretz Yisrael and consecrated it, it was not sanctified by means of conquest. But rather through chazakah, through settlement. Therefore, every place which was repossessed by the exiles returning from Babylon and consecrated when Ezra returned, consecrated the land the second time is sacred today. Thus, as explained in Hilchot Teruma, it is necessary to keep the laws of the sabbatical, etc., etc. But what we can conclude here is that Jerusalem has a special status. Its holiness it derives from God. I want to add to it that there are others who claim that Maimonides bases the eternal holiness of Jerusalem not solely on this verse from Chronicles, not on this notion that God's fire descended from heaven, but on a much more statutory understanding that the Sanhedrin was established in the temple, which meant that justice and law emanated from the Temple Mount. What granted the temple eternal holiness was that it was seen as a source of justice in the world. So you could have either one of them. It was a source of God's presence, or it was a source of justice, which is a reflection in this mode, a reflection of God's presence. Right. So what Maimonides is trying to do is as I said, to remove the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, from human control. Holiness is normalized as a legal category. God's holiness, it's a status, it's a state, right? It is holy, and that's it. It's nothing that you do. Now, Rabbi Abraham ibn Daud disagreed with Maimonides. He wrote glosses on Maimonides' code, and he writes as follows. This ruling derives from his own reason, and I know not where it comes from, meaning Maimonides has no source in the Talmud for claiming that the Jerusalem's holiness is eternal because the Shekhinah sanctified Jerusalem and the temple. According to the view that the first sanctification goes on and on, moreover, I say that even according to Rabbi Yosef, who said that the second sanctification was meant to be forever, right? He only said this regarding the rest of the land, but regarding Jerusalem and the temple, he did not say it. So, right? For Ezra knew when Ezra came back with the Babylonian Jews in the 6th century to resettle Eretz Yisrael, Ezra knew that the temple in Jerusalem would change in the future and be sanctified by another eternal sanctification with the glory of God forever. This was revealed to me, God's mystery to those who fear him. Therefore, one who enters there, the temple site, today is not liable for excision. So this is what Ibn Daud is saying. He's saying, according to Maimonides, where the temple site is forever eternally holy, and since it's a site of God's sanctification, if a person enters the temple site without proper purification, then they are due the punishment of karet, excision, whatever that means. They're cut off. We're not sure exactly what that means. Their years are shortened. They don't attain the Olam Haba, the world to come. Unclear how we understand karet. So Ibn Daud says, wrong. There's no karet for entering the Temple Mount, because when Ezra came and returned, Ezra didn't rely on the sanctification of Solomon. He understood that Jerusalem was not to be re-sanctified until the final redemption when the Messiah comes. How do I know this? Says Ibn Daud, because Thus it was revealed to me God's mystery to those who fear him. So Maimonides was a rationalist. Ibn Daud was a mystic. So the mystic Ibn Daud says, Maimonides, where did you get this ruling? It's a result of your own reasoning. Terrible. It's a function of your reasoning. But I know about the Temple Mount because I've had a mystical experience. Get it? You understand what's going on? It's a fantastic argument. Ibn Daud, the mystic, he knows the truth. Maimonides, who used his reason to understand that the temple has this eternal, or tried to establish on the basis of his own reasoning, that's flawed. But my understanding, which is due to some mystical experience, that's authoritative. So here you have the argument. According to Rambam, it's prohibited to enter the Temple Mount. Because the Temple Mount is eternal and holy, stay away from it. The Maimonides' rational project, it's true throughout the guide, is to distance us from the magic of the temple and to establish the rational approach of the law. The law is a sober way for living in the world. Mysticism drives you to illusory fantasies about the presence of God and about your own power. So Maimonides establishes a law that prevents you from access to the holy, because access to the holy drives you towards sort of passionate imagination that you're in God's place, in God's time, and you're able to do all sorts of things in order to bring about the final redemption of God and God's presence in the world. And it's justified. You justify the ends, the mean. I'm sorry. You justify the means because of the end that you're going to bring about God's presence. All right. So Maimonides wants to avoid the craziness that results from the mystification of the holy. And by making the holy subject to a legal category, he actually reduces the power of the holy, because we're not in charge of it. It's God's domain. And we have to operate in a rational universe. That's why, by the way, Maimonides would claim that's why the Torah insists that there's only one central temple. Because by making only one central temple, it made sure that the temple there was no temple in everybody's backyard. And it made sure that the priests had less authority. I mean, this is Maimonides' reading of the Torah. I mean, you understand why it's subversive. Right? There's only one temple, and the priests are only authoritative in the temple. That means Maimonides already understands Judaism as laying the groundwork for the emergence of the rabbis, where learning is possible everywhere, and where nobody is granted authority on the basis of heredity. Right? And where you access the divine through your reason rather than through a mystical experience. Right? And most important, because I'm not opposed to mysticism per se, where you refrain from engaging in a type of mystification of politics. That's where the danger is. Where the messianic ideal becomes politicized. Because then you're willing to do anything for the sake of bringing about redemption. So Maimonides wants to put a gap, a distance between us and that project of bringing about redemption before it's time. Okay, let's go on in the sources and see how this is reflected. And does anybody have a question up till now? Please interrupt. Let me know. Anyone? All right. So I'm not going to read all the sources. Let me tell you what's here. This is a famous midrash. Actually, this midrash, I think the Dibuk begins with this midrash. It's about the centrality of holiness of Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies. So this is a text that's much more consistent with Ibn Daud's understanding, with the fascinating understanding of the essential. Forget about Ibn Daud, the essential holiness of Jerusalem and the temple. But we're going to move away from that. This is a Talmudic text that's very important. We're not going to read it. It's about how two priests were running up the altar, running up the altar and wanting to be the first one to be able to offer the sacrifice. And as one priest was approaching, so the other priest somehow moved ahead of him. And when that other priest moved ahead of him, the priest that had fallen behind stabbed the first priest and killed him on the altar. So this is a classic story that depicts the passion, the zeal, and the outlawed behavior of those who are somehow taken and seduced by holiness. The willingness to kill for the sake of proximity with the divine. So this is a classic text, and then the Father comes. I mean, it's a horrible text because it talks about, is the knife pure or impure? Is the knife still in the body, or has it been? I mean, the intricacies of law when someone is dying. So you understand that the Talmud itself, there's a bit of a parody here on the abuse, and what I call here the scandal of holiness. But we're going to move beyond that. All right, and to this, wait, where's my next text here? What is this? Next here, not here. Okay, 1 second. I'm sorry. Yeah, right here. Maimonides. So Maimonides writes as follows. He takes a Talmudic passage and he turns it around. The Talmudic passage is about where you have to face when you facing, we face towards Jerusalem. That's our Qibla. That's our direction. All right. So what happens if you don't know the direction? What's going on the right of the screen? Do you all see that? No, I'm sorry, I have to do something about this. Excuse me? Okay, good. Okay. So Maimonides writes as follows. With face turned toward the temple. Anyone outside Palestine turns his face towards the land of Israel and recites the prayer. One who is in the Holy Land turns towards Jerusalem. One who is in Jerusalem turns towards the temple. If one is in the temple, he turns towards the Holy of Holies. A person who is either blind or unable to determine the right direction, or is on a ship, directs his heart to the divine presence and prays. This is a fantastic text. I'll tell you why. Because in the Talmud, the person who is blind comes first. And then the text builds from the blind towards the Holy of Holies. All right, which seems to be a natural progression to the central place of holiness. Okay? But what Maimonides has done by placing the blind person at the end of the passage is tell you that place as a physical place is less important than the direction of your heart. What he's doing is participating in a program, right? In a project, which I call the abstraction of holiness and the spiritualization of holiness, the movement away from holy place to holy time, to holy ideas, to holy behavior, to holy direction of one's heart, to holiness within rather than without. And Maimonides does it brilliantly because he turns around the Talmud so that the blind person becomes the goal of the passage, so that we understand that the blind person is really the person who's direct. He's our teacher, the blind person, he or she, because the blind person understands holiness as something within and not something without in a particular place. Now, this has a long tradition. It's not just Maimonides, because Maimonides sees it already in the text. After all, in Exodus, what do we learn? Vasuli Mikdash, right? Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. So it seems as if God actually lives in the sanctuary, and that the sanctuary holds God in place. All right. Yet in Deuteronomy, what do we read? We read here, you shall rejoice, your son, your daughter, your male, and the widow and the myth, at the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. The temple or the Mishkan, God's dwelling, is not because God lives there, but because God's name is assigned to that place. So the Torah already, it moves from the physical presence of God to the abstract spiritualization of God's presence. Okay? Here, by the way, is the Talmudic passage. You can see that it says the sages taught a blind person, so it starts with the blind. We don't have to read it, and then it goes through all of those. And then we read Maimonides. All right. Now, this notion of the inner spirituality, is taken, it seems to me, is presented brilliantly by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. And I think it's important that we see it, who the sources are. Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin was the principal student of the Gaon of Vilna, and he established the greatest yeshiva in Lithuania, the yeshiva of Volozhin, where Rabbi Kook himself was a student, where Chaim Nachman Bialik was a student, as well as many, Yosef Chaim Brenner, many famous rabbis, teachers, poets, people of Jewish culture studied in Volozhin. It was I don't know if we can use Ivy League images. I don't know if we're allowed to use them any longer. But they had the best basketball team at Volozhin for sure. Okay. Anyway, so Rabbi Chaim writes in his Nefesh HaChaim as follows. And according to our method, we can say also that it desires to convey, that is the verse that says, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell within them, to convey, don't think that my focus, this is God, of intention is the external holy temple. It's fascinating. I'm giving you instructions to build a tabernacle and to build a temple, but don't think that that's the focus. Rather, you should know that the whole point of my intention regarding the physical design of the tabernacle and all its utensils is only to provide a hint for you so that you should see, and then you should do likewise to yourselves, that you should in your actions be completely holy and worthy and ready for my Shekhinah to actually settle within you. Unbelievable. This is specifically, and they shall make me a holy temple or a sanctuary, and I will dwell within them, not within it. Right? That all I show you the plans of the tabernacle. My entire intention is that you should do the same with yourselves. I'm giving you a model for building a temple. So when you build it physically, you'll understand that the physical representation is only a symbol of what you should really do, because the real work is building the temple within yourselves. So all this excitement, all this control over place, has nothing to do with the essence of religiosity, according to Chaim of Volozhin. It's idolatrization of the temple, rather than the essence being the work that you do within yourselves to make yourselves a holy sanctuary. Now, Chaim of Volozhin is not the only one who said this. It's a Hasid. This is where the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, the Hasidim and their opponents, agreed 100%. The famous Hasidic interpretation, right? Within them rather than within it, in order to teach you that each person is obligated to build a tabernacle within his or her heart. Make me a tabernacle and I shall dwell. The Kotzker Rebbe says, where does God dwell? Kotzker answered, wherever we let God in. This is the meaning of make me a tabernacle. If a person's inner life is pervaded by love and fear of God, then I will dwell within them. Even Rashi already says this. Every Jew is obligated to introduce holiness into their home and personal life, such that the atmosphere in the house is brimming with holiness. Then I will dwell within them. I mean, you know that the table and the table is our altar and we wash our hands. I mean, all of that symbolism, it's taken very seriously to distance us from the centrality of place that we think that it's the physical presence that we're looking for. We're looking to arrive at a spiritual place rather than a physical place. So one understanding of Jerusalem is this spiritual abstraction. The next understanding of Jerusalem that I want to present, and then we'll have some time, I think, because I'll go through rather quickly now as we move on, is in the prophetic tradition. What does Isaiah say? Right? Tzedek yalin ba. Justice, the city that was filled with justice. In the same chapter 1 of Isaiah, it says, Zion b'mishpat tipadeh. Zion will be redeemed in righteousness, in justice. V'shaveha b'tzedakah. And those who return to her in righteousness. Rabbi David Kimchi notices something very interesting. We're not going to, right? When Abraham conquers, right, in his battle in Genesis 14, Salem, right? The king of Salem, Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, approaches him. What's Salem? Salem is Jerusalem. We'll get to it in a moment. What is the name of the king of Jerusalem? Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. When Joshua comes to the Jebusite, Jerusalem, what was then the Jebusite, the city, the king of the city is Adoni Tzedek. Very interesting. The kings of the city all carry the moniker of righteousness, right? Of justice and righteousness. Said that. So what is Jerusalem? Jerusalem's not a place. Jerusalem is a place that emanates righteousness. It's a center of judgment. It's not a physical. Its significance. It's not in its physical presence, but its significance is the fact that it's the seat of justice, and symbolizes universal justice. Furthermore, not only was Jerusalem sort of spiritualized, not only was Jerusalem a place of universal justice, as it's represented in our tradition, but the Midrash says as follows. Danielle will remember this Midrash, I think. It's a Midrash on this conquest by Abraham. Abraham, when Abraham brings Isaac to the altar, so he names the place on Mount Moriah Hashem Yireh. God will see or will be seen, Yera'eh, Yireh. All right? Now, what the Midrash says as follows. And Abraham called the name of the place Hashem Yireh. God will show. Abraham called it Yireh. And Abraham called the name of that place Hashem Yireh. Shem called it Shalem. And Melchizedek, king of Shalem. So what's going on here? So the Mount Moriah, as you know, is identified with the location of the Temple Mount, Jerusalem. When Abraham came to Mount Moriah, he named it the place where God will show, the place where God will be seen, etc. Right? Hashem Yera'eh, Hashem Yireh. But Shem is another name here for Melchizedek, because that's the descendant of Adam, and Melchizedek was a monotheistic, pre-Abrahamic monotheist, right? Who was the king of Shalem, and he's seen as a descendant of Shem, and the name Shem is assigned to him. So Shem named Jerusalem Shalem. Abraham named Mount Moriah, i.e., that is Jerusalem, Yireh, Hashem Yireh. So God says as follows, said the Holy One, if I call it Yireh, as did Abraham, Shem, a righteous man, will complain. Because he'll say, why are you favoring Abraham? I'm devoted to you. I'm a monotheist. And if I call it Shalem, as did Shem, Abraham, a righteous man, will complain. That's right. I'm devoted to God. Therefore, God says, I shall therefore call it as both of them called it. Yeru Shalem. Yireh Shalem. So the Midrash already recognizes, it seems to me, the universal significance of Jerusalem. It's not just Abraham's city. It's the city of the Canaanite king, Melchizedek, who was a monotheist. It's the city that invites people who are devoted to God and justice to be part of that city. It's a city that transcends any one people controlling it. It can't be controlled by humans. It's beyond human control. It's in the holy domain. You know who said this? Bill Clinton said this in his negotiations. He said that Jerusalem will be in some sort of an international enclave beyond human domination, because it's not meant to be controlled by anyone. Because the person who controls it has fantasies about their power and their significance. And we need to we need to do a Rambam move and distance them, right? Bill Clinton was learning the Rambam, right? So he understood that. Now, I brought more text. We're not going to read this. This is a midrash that was a medieval midrash. It was found to be in Iraq, Iran, and Persia, and it has an old tradition, but the tradition is fantastic. It says, why did the Muslims build the mosque over the holy site? After all, the holy site, it says in Deuteronomy, God's presence will remain forever. So the Midrash says, indeed, God's presence is on the holy mountain even today. Why? Because the Muslims have built their holy temple shrine over our holy temple, because it's drawing on the holiness of the site. So we shouldn't see the mosque as competitive with our holiness. It's an affirmation of our holiness. And this is a Midrash. Don't see the mosque as something that has to be torn down. It's evidence that this is a holy site. Celebrate its presence, and say, and study Isaiah together. Why? Because what does Isaiah say? Isaiah says, "Let the foreigner say, let not the foreigner say, who has attached himself to the Lord will keep me apart from his people, and let not the right? I will give them of everlasting name to minister to him and to love the name of God, to be a servant. All who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who do not fast my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mount, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offering, everyone, Jews, non-Jews, Gentiles, all people who want to show their devotion will share this place." And Micah put it actually more poignantly. He said, "Nation shall not take up sword against nation," quoting Isaiah chapter 2. "They shall never again know war, but every man," he adds, "every man shall sit under his great vine with no one to disturb them, for it was the Lord of hosts who spoke." And then Micah adds, "Though all the peoples walk each in the names of its gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever." This is a pluralistic vision of Micah, that the Temple Mount is the place of the unification of all nations. And the dream that we will all be able to walk side by side, praying in our own languages to the God that we name, except that we know the secret, all of us, that the God that we name is the same God that you name, and that we're all devoted to the oneness of being. And we approach the oneness of being through our distinct, different ways of being religious. And that's the way we understand unification. Unification doesn't mean the dominance of one truth over the others, but the celebration of the variety of approaches to attain the connection. Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, writing about Isaiah's vision, you know what? I'll tell you just one line from Hershenson. He lived during the time of the establishment of the League of Nations, and he said, "The League of Nations doesn't understand. The real hall of unification and peace will be in the future Third Temple." Why? Because in the Third Temple, there won't be any nationalism. There won't be any flags. When you come to the League of Nations, you see everybody's flag, and everybody is interested in the power and in the significance of their own national, their national achievement. The Temple of Jerusalem is a place where all nationalisms will somehow disappear, and people will be able to transcend their national commitments through a sense of unity and common purpose. Common purpose. God represents common direction and purpose. Right? That's what the text is looking for. However, now here we have the politicians in Israel. Tzipi Hoteveli. I think her. I wrote it down. She's now the ambassador to the United Kingdom. She knows a lot about Jewish law, and she writes, "The construction of the temple and its place on the Temple Mount should symbolize the renewal of the sovereignty of the people of Israel in this land." In other words, this is explicitly what we want to stay away from. The temple cannot be the site of our sovereignty. It's a site of God's sovereignty. To claim that it's a site of our sovereignty is heresy. It's antagonistic to God, right? It's idolatry. This is a representative of the Israeli government who wants to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. That's her dream. Gila Gamliel, who's the minister of innovation, she says the temple is the people of Israel's ID card. We are the Beit Mikdash. It's the nation of Israel's direct contact with the divine. It's our right over this land. Politics. This is the weaponization of the holy. Whoever controls the Temple Mount controls the land, is in control of the Middle East, right? That's the war. This is a declaration of war of Jews against Muslims. We want to engage them in their language in this way. And instead of embracing rationalism, they're embracing the dreams of messianism. Moshe Feiglin, it's not a religious thing. I mean, he says it openly. It's about sovereignty. We are here on the Temple Mount on a national mission. Every Jew that goes up the mountain, every single Jewish foot suddenly ascending the Temple Mount, reclaims Israel's sovereignty, not only on the mountain, but for our whole land. Right? The menorah, symbol of the state of Israel, return in our day to illuminate our temple, God willing, when we destroy the Muslim sanctuary. Right? That's what we're going to do. All right. Now, finally, Froman, who is an unbelievable, he was a student of Rabbi Kook, but listen to what he says. The national religious publics concept consists of two very forceful elements: a very realistic, materializing one, the actual settlement of the entire Eretz Israel, and a messianic, spiritual one, objection to entering the Temple Mount. The messianic element is perceived from an Orthodox point of view, waiting silently for the Messiah, not creating a false Messiah by our own hands, right? Ascending the Temple Mount, false Messiah, right? Violation. The holiness of the Temple Mount is expressed not by barging into it, but rather by withdrawing from it. Holiness means taboo, stay away, danger, not for you to dabble with. You're going to get burned, right? You'll be burned, and others will be burned along with you if you start to play around with holiness. We learn from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai the famous teaching: if a sapling's in your hand and someone tells you, "Behold, there's a Messiah," you go on planting the sapling. And if the youth say to you, "Let us go up and build a temple," do not listen to them. But if the elders say to you, "Come, let us destroy the temple," listen to them. For the building of youth is destruction, and the destruction of old age is building. Proof of the matter is Rehoboam, son of Solomon. We don't have time. I want you to puzzle over this because it's one of the great, I think, teachings. It's sort of like a Jewish kohen. This is a Zen teaching of Judaism, right? Again, the building of youth is destruction, and the destruction of old age is building. The wisdom of old age, to wait, not to rush to build, whereas the rush to build itself can be a destructive effort if it's not taken with a degree of forethought. And finally, this poem that appeared in the collection of modern contemporary Hebrew poetry about the Temple Mount, the Mount, the Temple in our hands. The poet writes as follows: "Why did you turn your backs on Yavne? What are you doing trying to rebuild the temple? Yochanan ben Zakkai established Yavne, the glories of Yavne and study and text and rabbinic Judaism, which democratized Judaism, no longer reliance on priests, no longer any sacrifices. Coming back here to spill blood upon the mount? That's why you've come here. As if thousands of sheep and cattle weren't enough. As if Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai never mattered. Because what did Yochanan ben Zakkai teach us? Zecher, right? Zecher l'mikdash. She taught us to remember the temple, not to rebuild the temple. Remember it in your rabbinic ways, by building the temple inside yourselves and in your homes. Why did we carry all of this? Why did we carry Judaism all these thousands of years? Prayers, Torah study, and acts of kindness. How to reach this moment when now you want to rebuild the temple? Don't you know the advantage of the religion that you have attained? How will dews of blessing descend from heaven if the fires of child sacrifice rise again in the valley? If blood once more flows here, undammed, saturating soil trampled like a courtyard. Beware of the holiness of the Temple Mount. Any questions, please? Yes.
I mean, I'll share one if no one else will.
Go ahead.
Chaim, you got half of your quintessential line in there, which is the tension between universalism and
particularism.
And so as such, you presented
by
that.
the way, just since you said that, so the what do you call it? The Isaiah's vision is a great example of that. Whereas we're marching up, the vision is of we're marching up towards the Jewish site, but we're marching up with others alongside us. And I think you have to see it symbolically, not literally. It doesn't mean, oh, okay, let's now organize a world mission of all the different religions and to worship at our temple. I mean, that's not a bad thing to do, but not because we have the site, but because it presents us with an opportunity to create a universal experience. And other peoples should be able to create universal experiences around their sites as well. That's what this is a model of.
Right. You presented two core challenges, among others, but two that I want to see which one you think is more at stake or more costly to us as a people. Okay. One is that we've failed to realize that Jerusalem symbolizes a universal idea of justice. And the other is that we have sort of tarnished we failed to understand what the particularist manifestations of Jerusalem as holy for Jews should be about, right? That it's we've
distorted it.
We've distorted it. Both are problems. If you had to choose, which has greater implications for us as a people? Which one should we be wrestling with more at this time?
It's complicated. I tell you, I think that the more immediate issue is the issue of justice, but the issue as I look down the line, it's the messianic issue, which is the second one that the universalism and the particularism. In other words, underlying all of this is the notion that the rebuilding of the temple is a step in the direction of the arrival of the Messiah, and that our redemption depends upon our reconstruction of our holy site. So that the reason that I say that that Jerusalem is a source of justice, I don't know how you feel, I'm interested in what you have to say, needs to be our immediate concern, is that I think that we've lost our way in terms of our understanding of justice. There's the sense of universal justice. And we see that in the fact that, the International Criminal Court is holding us responsible for what's happened. And we sort of we're violating universal norms.
Right.
And we need to be able to confront that. And I think now it may be, however, just to argue the other side, that the messianic vision and the need to control the Temple Mount and because we have to provide the occasion for the coming of the Messiah. That's really the issue, because when we enter into messianic thinking, then we lose our sense of normal cause and effect, because we believe that we're in God's time, and when we're in God's time, then we believe that God will do whatever we need to achieve the end, and so we can act as irresponsibly as we want, because God will redeem us. If you remember the late 80s, people remember there were the 1980s. In the late 80s, there was a movement called the Machteret, the underground. And the underground wanted to blow up the Temple Mount. So after they captured them, the Shin Bet captured the crew. I think all of them have been freed. They've been granted granted. What do you grant? Amnesty. They've been granted amnesty, right? So when they asked them, they said, "What did you imagine if you blew up the Temple Mount? There would be a world war would ensue, and all the countries, all the Arab nations, all the Muslim nations would be lined up the next day to do battle with Israel." So you know what they answered? They said, "Of course, that's exactly what we want, because then God would be forced to show his stuff. And God would come and redeem us." So they're not operating in a rational world. They're operating in God's time. Morality no longer plays a role in God's time, because we're operating according to God's morals. God says, do this, that's moral, because God said it. Now, this is a mirror image of what you have on the Islamic side. The same language, the same justifications, the same type of thinking. So maybe you're right that the universal particular, as I place it in messianic terms, is really the overarching issue. And unfortunately, I don't think we have the privilege to say, well, I'm going to focus on this one and not on the other one. I think we have to focus on both of them. I mean, it really worries me about the fact that we've lost our perspective on justice, and at the same time, that our moral compass has been distorted by visions of messianic redemption. and our obligations, the obligations that ensue. What's interesting, I was talking to Morris about this before, is the fact that, these sort of somewhat elusive and arcane texts really speak to us, because whether people know these texts or not, they're basically operating according to the directions that these texts yield. And that's why it's all the more important for us to sort of reclaim the heart of Judaism. And we have, and I really feel this, that all of us, it's not, and not leave it, say to Orthodox Jews learn, they are the learners. They can't be the learners. We all have to be the learners. And we all have to be able to, to utilize, well, not just utilize, to understand the significance of our teachings. And I also think I'm going to, conclude. It is late. I mean, this translation of this poem, the poem speaks volumes, because the poem understands something. What do you want to rebuild the temple for? I sometimes ask, I ask the Chabadnik, the Mashiach's going to come. What are you going to do? Are they going to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash? All right, you're going to rebuild the temple. What are you going to do there? It's going to become a big abattoir. How many sheep are you going to slaughter every day? Is that really what it's about? Is that what we've aimed for? That's what the poet is saying. And not only is he saying that, the poet says, I know how much blood has been shed historically at this site and around it. Right nearby the Temple Mount is Gehinom, where the Molech was sacrificed. We're talking about antiquity, right? Paganism. This is what you want in Israel today, a rebirth of paganism? Because the height of the pagan achievement is going to be that you slaughter each other. Look at the tradition that Yochanan ben Zakkai gave you, and you're willing to trade that back for the glories of a building. So that's what this is about. Now we have to understand that as we discuss these texts, we have neighbors who are also discussing the holiness of this site, and I think it's important that we engage in a conversation with them, so that we both understand that we shouldn't be killing each other over stones, right? You know that line from was that Yesh Avanim im Lev, Yesh Anashim im Lev Shel Even veYesh Avanim im Lev Adam. There are human beings. This is taken from one of Rav Kook's writings. There are human beings with hearts of stone, and there are stones with hearts of human beings. All right. So I think that the thrust of what we've learned today is to find the heart of the human being, right? And to see that as central rather than the stones as central, and to overcome that urge, which is a universal urge, a natural urge to sanctify place and power and control, and to understand that withdrawal, that restraint, that's really the measure of the tradition, and where religion can actually be a counterforce to this, to violence and the assertion of power. All right, let's hope. We have to hope. A last word that I have is on a positive side, even though nobody asked me about this, is that maybe the declaration by these three countries today of a recognition of the Palestinians is actually a good thing. Because if we understand it to its depth, it is a defeat both of Hamas and of Netanyahu. It's a defeat of Hamas because Hamas is opposed to two states. It doesn't want a Muslim state alongside the state of Israel. That's what these nations want. And equally, our friend Netanyahu also doesn't want two states. So perhaps this is a wake-up call to the possibility and the renewal of the pursuit of two states, where we have a willingness to recognize each other and understand that we both have a share here in this place. And we have to look at our neighbors. That's the most important thing. And that's what people are afraid of. On campus, there's anti-normalization, so they don't talk to one another. And so they won't talk to the Zionists. The fear is, if you actually talk to someone, you might discover that they're a human being. So that's what we have to push for, that people actually talk to one another. And hopefully it's not too late. See you in Jerusalem, walking up the Temple Mount. Okay.
From your mouth to God's ear, Chaim.
Okay.
Toda rabah.
Take care,
Thank you
everyone.
so much.
Chaim Yashikoach, you're
Wow.
brilliant. You're brilliant. And you need to be teaching the prime minister now, and you need to be the next prime minister.
Well, the only one who taught the guy who taught the prime minister was David Hartman. I don't know if you know that. David
Oh.
Hartman learned with Paris, and so but you know, and don't forget that Ben Gurion, every Saturday night that Ben Gurion was prime minister, there was a class in Tanakh, in Bible, in Ben Gurion's house, and all those discussions with scholars, with visitors, all those discussions are recorded and printed and published. And Ben Gurion made sure that he was in contact with the intellectuals, with the spiritual. In fact, there's a movie that you should all see called Ben Gurion Epilogue. It's an hour and a quarter if you can find it. It's hard to find it. But at some point, after the state is declared, there's a clip of Ben Gurion having a meeting with the Hebrew University intellectuals, you know, with Martin Buber and Ernst Simon, who were binationalists, right? And Ben Gurion tells them, now I need you. Not because this is my edition, not because I'm going to listen to you, but I want to hear what you have to say. Because what you have to say will be a control on how I behave. Not because I'm going to follow everything you say, but what you say will have meaning and significance to me in terms of how I make a decision. And that's why the conversation is so important. And the lack of conversation across boundaries and between different groups means everybody's in their own little place listening to one another. See, that's a leader for you. When Ben Gurion says to the people who are his opponents, the binationalists, I mean, they were cursing them. You know, the dreamers, Magnus, and, you know, all these, Ernst Simon, all these guys. You know, what do they know about building a state? All right, when the state is established, Ben Gurion says, now I need to hear from you, because your critique is going to be critical to how we function in the future. Not because your critique is going to be policy, but your critique will play a role, or might play a role, and I want to hear it. And we know that he kept up a lively correspondence with those intellectuals. So that's something that's missing today. All right, to be continued. Shalom, shalom, and time to conclude.
Shalom.
Thank you, Chaim.
Later.
Later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay
So much.